The handcuffs clicked at 4:47 p.m., but Franklin Williams stopped hearing them at 4:34 p.m. When Officer Sean Anderson said
the thing about tax dollars, 434, he would remember that. The time his constitutional law textbook lay open to Terry v. Ohio, the page he'd been highlighting when the shadow fell across reasonable suspicion. The time his highlighter, still uncapped, bled neon yellow through 3 pages of Fourth Amendment protections, while his hands were pulled behind his back. "Stand up, you're leaving." Franklin looked up from the oak table where he'd sat since 2:00 p.m., since before the afternoon light shifted from gold to institutional gray. The officer's face was backlit by the library's tall windows, a silhouette with a badge. Franklin's first thought was bizarrely practical. The recording is still running. He knew this because of the red light. The tiny red light beside his laptop camera that he'd stopped noticing 2 hours ago when he actually started focusing on Terry v. Ohio instead of watching himself not focus. His study group called it accountability theater, 90 minutes of self-surveillance, played back at 2x speed to witness your own wandering attention. Franklin had been 47 minutes into his second session when the officer arrived. "Am I being detained?" The words came out steady. Uncle Altan's voice in his head, 8 years old now, from a kitchen table in Baltimore. "Stay calm. State it clearly. Let them talk." "Yeah, you're detained." Anderson's hand moved to his belt. "Stand up." Franklin stood slowly, palms visible, the way Alton had demonstrated with his own hands spread on Formica. The laptop screen showed his reflection. Gray hoodie, headphones around his neck, the same outfit he'd worn to 3 constitutional law study sessions this week. He watched himself watching Anderson in the screen's corner, a recursive image of a man about to be arrested for studying the document that was supposed to prevent his arrest. "My tax dollars aren't training people like you to argue with me." The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone at a nearby table sucked in breath. Franklin felt the sentence land in his stomach, heavy and familiar. The weight of every "you don't belong here" he'd absorbed since middle school, since being told he was articulate for a black kid. Since the security guard at the Baltimore Public Library followed him through the stacks. He felt it land, and then he felt something else. The red light still recording. "Let them incriminate themselves," Alton had said. "The more they talk, the more evidence you have." Franklin looked at Anderson's chest. The blue LED on the body camera. 2 red lights, 1 blue, 3 cameras in a library built to protect the law. He almost smiled, almost. "I'm standing," Franklin said, voice still even, hands still visible. "I want to be clear for the record. I do not consent to being detained. I do not consent to any search. I am complying under protest." Anderson pulled his arms back, the metal bit cold against his wrists, and Franklin thought, "This is the test I didn't study for. This is the exam." The holding cell smelled of industrial cleaner and old anxiety, the particular scent of institutions that processed human beings through categories. Franklin sat on the bench and watched the clock on the wall, analog, loud, designed to make waiting feel like punishment. His wrists throbbed where the handcuffs had been. He hadn't been allowed his phone. He hadn't been allowed his laptop. He had been allowed 1 call, and he'd used it on Alton. "Don't touch that file. Don't edit it. Don't move it." His uncle's voice, 30 minutes later in the library, had been terrifyingly calm. They'd driven back from the station in silence, Alton's retired FBI hands steady on the wheel, until Franklin remembered the laptop was still there, still recording. The library staff had assumed he'd stepped away. The table was exactly as he'd left it. Constitutional law textbook splayed open, yellow highlighter bleeding through Terry v. Ohio, the red light beside the camera still burning. Now Franklin watched Alton watch the playback in the library's fading evening light. There was Franklin studying. There was Anderson approaching. There was the shadow falling across reasonable suspicion. There was the tax dollars line, captured in 1080p, Anderson's voice clear as the library's silence. "Copy it to cloud backup right now," Alton said. "Then we're taking this laptop to a lawyer." But Franklin wasn't thinking about lawyers. He was thinking about the other students. The ones who'd filed complaints that went nowhere. He'd heard whispers in the law school lounge. Anderson got someone again. But he'd never connected them, never understood they were chapters in the same book. He thought of Jasmine Carter, who'd graduated last spring, who'd mentioned something about affirmative action in the library before changing the subject. He thought of Marcus Chen, who'd stopped using private study rooms after an incident. "Uncle Alton," Franklin said, his voice strange in his own ears. "What if I'm not the first?" Alton paused the video. In the frozen frame, Anderson's mouth was open mid-sentence, the tax dollars line half-formed. His uncle turned to look at him, and Franklin saw something shift in his face. The investigator's instinct, the civil rights specialist who'd spent 27 years documenting patterns. "Connecting dots. Then we find them," Alton said. "We find every student he stopped, every complaint that was dismissed, every time someone was told they didn't belong in a place built for learning. And we show them what 3 cameras can do when the system pretends to be blind." Franklin nodded. But sitting in the holding cell now, watching the analog clock tick, he felt the weight of what came next. Not the legal battle, he understood that, could navigate that. The other weight. The knowledge that his recording, his perfect victimhood, his Uncle Alton training, might be the only reason anyone would finally listen. That without the red light, without the body camera, without the security footage, he would be what the other 7 had been, dismissed, counseled, forgotten. The cell door opened. A sergeant with a clipboard. "Williams, someone's here to see you." Franklin stood, expecting Alton. Instead, a woman in her 50s, gray streaking her black hair, wearing a blazer that had seen better courtrooms. She didn't introduce herself. She just looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, recognition maybe, or exhaustion. "Professor Diana Santos," she said, "Civil Rights Law and Franklin. You're the 8th student in 3 years to sit in that cell after meeting Officer Anderson. I know because I've been waiting for the one who could prove it." The file folder on Professor Santos's desk was 3 inches thick, labeled in her handwriting, "Campus Police, Anderson S." Franklin opened it and found his own future documented in 8 different handwritings, 8 different traumas, 8 different versions of the same story he was living. "Aisha Johnson, April 2022. You don't look like you belong here anyway." Carlos Mendoza, September 2022. "Medical students don't dress like that." Priya Patel, January 2023. "Hacking into library computers." DeAndre Brooks, June 2023. "I pay taxes that fund your scholarship." Jasmine Carter, October 2023. "Affirmative action doesn't mean you can do whatever you want." Marcus Chen, February 2024. "Where are you really from?" Tiffany Rodriguez, May 2024. "This isn't a social club for people like you." And now him. October 2024. "My tax dollars aren't training people like you." Franklin read them in order, watching the language evolve from vague othering to explicit taxation rhetoric. As if Anderson had been testing boundaries, learning what he could get away with. The complaints were attached, formal, typed, filed, and beneath each one the same dismissal letter, insufficient evidence of misconduct. Officer counseled on communication. "Communication," Franklin said aloud. The word felt obscene. "He told Jasmine Carter that affirmative action didn't mean she could do whatever she wanted," Santos said. She stood at her office window, looking down at the law library where it had all happened. She filed her complaint the same day, quoted him verbatim. They said there was no evidence to corroborate. Franklin looked at the dismissal on Jasmine's complaint. Then he opened his laptop. The OBS file was still there, 4 hours and 38 minutes, the tax dollars line time-stamped at 16:34:22. He dragged the playhead to the moment. Anderson's voice filled the office. "My tax dollars aren't training people like you to argue with me." Santos didn't turn from the window. "Play it again." He did, and again. On the 3rd play, she finally turned, and Franklin saw that her eyes were wet, not with sadness, but with something harder, older. The rage of someone who'd been waiting 3 years for a piece of evidence that couldn't be dismissed. "3 cameras," she said. "Your laptop, his body cam, the library security system. 3 angles of the same constitutional violation. Do you understand what you have, Franklin?" He thought he did. But then she opened a second folder, this one unlabeled, and spread its contents across her desk. Photocopies of incident reports, 340 of them. 11 years of Officer Sean Anderson's interactions with Georgetown students. "I've been collecting these through public records requests," Santos said. Every stop, every detention, every welfare check in a library or study space. I couldn't prove the pattern without the names. FERPA protected the student identities, but I could see the locations. The times, the justifications. She pulled out a statistical analysis, graphs showing 89 library stops in 3 years. 80% minority students in a 40% minority student body. I knew I just couldn't prove they were real people. Franklin looked at the graphs, the cold mathematics of bias. Then he looked at his laptop, the human face of it. Himself studying being interrupted, the red light still burning in the corner of the frame. What if they won't release the body cam footage? He asked. Santos smiled. It wasn't kind. Then we sue them for it. We sue them for everything. Not just your arrest, every complaint they dismissed, every pattern they ignored, every student they told to accept communication counseling as justice. She leaned forward. But Franklin, I need to know you're ready for what comes next. Because once we file, you become the face of this, the perfect victim, the law student arrested for studying the Fourth Amendment. They will dig into your past, they will try to find reasons you deserved it, and you will have to be flawless. Franklin thought of Alton's training. Stay calm, state it clearly, let them talk. But he also thought of the handcuffs, the cold metal, the way his stomach had dropped when Anderson said people like you. He wasn't flawless. He was angry. He was scared. He was tired of being the one who had to be perfect to be believed. I'm not flawless, he said, but I have the recording. Santos studied him for a long moment, then she nodded. That's enough. That's always been enough. They just made us believe it wasn't. The deposition room was designed to intimidate. Corporate beige, windowless, the air conditioning set to a temperature that kept you awake but uncomfortable. Franklin sat in the corner, watching Professor Santos prepare, and realized he was afraid. Not of Anderson, he'd faced that fear already. Afraid of what came after truth when truth wasn't enough. Sean Anderson entered with 2 attorneys, his posture that of a man who had been told he was protected. He wore a suit that didn't fit, the shoulders too broad, as if he was still wearing his uniform underneath. He didn't look at Franklin. He'd never looked at Franklin, not really. Even in the library, he'd looked through him, at the idea of him, the threat he represented in Anderson's taxonomy of belonging. Officer Anderson, Santos began, do you remember arresting Franklin Williams on October 15, 2024? Yes. Do you remember telling Mr. Williams that your tax dollars weren't training people like him? Anderson shifted. I don't recall saying that. Santos pulled out a laptop. Franklin watched his own face appear on the screen, gray hoodie, headphones, the moment before everything changed. He couldn't watch himself watching Anderson. He looked at Anderson instead, watching the officer watch himself on video. My tax dollars aren't training people like you to argue with me. The voice filled the room, Anderson's voice. Clear as the day he'd said it, preserved in digital amber. Do you recall it now? Santos asked. I may have said something like that. What did you mean by people like you? Anderson's attorney objected. Santos reminded him this was a deposition, not a trial. Anderson cleared his throat. I meant people who argue with police officers. You didn't mean black people? No. Santos pulled out the incident report from April 2022. Franklin watched Anderson's face as she read Aisha Johnson's account. You don't look like you belong here anyway. He watched the micro-expression, the flinch that wasn't quite surprise. What did you mean by didn't look like she belonged? She seemed out of place. She was a first-year law student in the law library. How was she out of place? Silence. Anderson looked at his attorney, who nodded slightly. I don't recall the specifics. Santos moved to DeAndre Brooks. The tax dollars comment from June 2023, a year before Franklin's arrest. I pay taxes that fund your scholarship. She read it slowly, letting the words land. Why did you assume Mr. Brooks had a scholarship? I don't know. Mr. Brooks didn't have a scholarship. He was paying full tuition. Did you make the same assumption about white students? Objection. Santos didn't wait. She moved to Jasmine Carter, October 2023. Affirmative action doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. She pulled out Jasmine's complaint, filed the same day, quoting Anderson verbatim. You're saying she fabricated this? I don't recall saying that. Santos leaned forward. Officer Anderson, over 3 years you stopped 89 students in campus libraries. 71 were minorities. Georgetown's student body is 40% minority. Can you explain the statistical disparity? Anderson stared at the paper she'd slid across the table. Franklin watched him read the numbers, the probability calculation, the 0.01% chance that the pattern was random. I stopped people who looked suspicious, Anderson said. And minority students looked more suspicious to you. That's not what I said. Then what made 71 minority students look suspicious while only 18 white students in the same locations? The silence lasted 11 seconds. Franklin counted. He'd learned to count silences in law school to let them stretch until someone broke. Anderson broke. I was doing my job. Your job was to protect students, Santos said. Not to police their presence based on race. Not to tell them their tax dollars didn't fund their education. Not to make them feel unsafe in spaces built for learning. She paused. Why did you invoke your Fifth Amendment right 14 times in your preparation for this deposition, Officer Anderson? Why did you refuse to answer questions about your specific statements to students unless granted immunity? Anderson's attorney objected again, but the objection sounded hollow. Franklin watched Anderson's face. The realization that the protection he'd been promised was provisional, that the system that had dismissed 8 complaints might not dismiss the 9th. That the red light on a student's laptop had changed the mathematics of accountability. I was advised by counsel, Anderson said quietly. In a civil case, Santos replied, invoking the Fifth allows the jury to draw an adverse inference. They can assume the answer would have incriminated you. She gathered her papers. No further questions. For now, the settlement negotiation took place in a conference room with a view of the Capitol dome, as if the proximity to power would remind everyone what justice was supposed to look like. Franklin sat between Santos and Alton, watching Georgetown's attorneys file in with their binders and their certainty. The opening offer, $500,000 to Franklin, $50,000 each to the other 7. Total $850,000. Santos rejected it within an hour. Your officer told my client that his tax dollars weren't training people like him, on camera, in a law library, while arresting a law student for studying. This case will be shown in every civil rights class in America for the next 20 years. Your offer is insulting. Franklin watched the lead attorney's face shift. He was young, younger than Santos, wearing the confidence of someone who'd never lost because he'd never taken a case he couldn't win. But he'd watched the depositions. He'd seen Anderson invoke the Fifth 14 times. He'd seen Chief Manning admit he hadn't reviewed body camera footage before dismissing complaints. He knew what a jury would see. $1.2 million to Franklin, $100,000 to each of the others, $1.9 million total. Santos didn't even glance at Franklin before rejecting it. We're not bargaining for silence. We're bargaining for accountability. The pattern is documented. The constitutional violations are established. And your insurance carrier has already informed you they won't cover above $5 million if this goes to trial. The attorney's confidence cracked, just slightly. You don't know that? I know that your carrier reviewed the case last week, Santos said. I know they told you that if the verdict exceeds $10 million, Georgetown is on its own. And I know that based on the depositions, a verdict of $15 million is conservative. Silence. The Capitol dome visible through the window, white against gray sky. Franklin thought of all the students who'd sat in that library, believing they were safe because they were smart, because they were enrolled, because they were following the rules. He thought of Jasmine Carter, working as a public defender now, who told him she still couldn't study in libraries without scanning for uniforms. He thought of the red light on his laptop, the tiny LED that had changed everything. I need to consult with my client, the attorney said. Consult, Santos replied. But understand that our next filing will be a motion to add the other 7 students as plaintiffs, and a request for Anderson's complete personnel file. We're done hiding the pattern behind individual settlements. We want systemic change, or we want a trial that exposes every failure of oversight for the past 11 years. They waited. Alton placed his hand on Franklin's shoulder, the same hand that had demonstrated the spread palm technique on a Baltimore kitchen table 8 years ago. The hand of an uncle who'd known this day might come, who'd prepared him not for if but for when. The attorney returned with new numbers. $2.5 million to Franklin, $300,000 to each of the others. $4.6 million total, plus reforms, plus oversight, plus the termination of Sean Anderson and the resignation of Chief Manning. Santos looked at Franklin. For the first time in 3 months of preparation, of depositions, of statistical analysis and legal strategy, she asked him directly, "What do you want?" Franklin thought of the holding cell. The analog clock, the way his wrists had throbbed. He thought of the 8 of them: Aisha, Carlos, Priya, DeAndre, Jasmine, Marcus, Tiffany himself, connected by a file folder and a pattern they'd never chosen. He thought of the students who would come after, who would study in the law library without knowing how close they'd come to being stopped, questioned, told they didn't belong. "I want the reforms," he said. "I want the oversight board, the quarterly training, the published reports. I want the next student who gets stopped to have somewhere to go that isn't Professor Santos's office after 3 years of silence." He paused. "And I want $3.2 million. Not because I'm worth more than the others, because I had the recording, because I was lucky, and I want to use that luck to make sure nobody needs it again." Santos smiled. She turned to the attorney. "You heard my client. $3.2 million to Franklin Williams, $400,000 to $800,000 to the others based on severity, mandatory reforms, and a $500,000 scholarship fund for civil rights law students." She stood, extending her hand. "Or we see you in court, and I put Anderson on the stand to invoke the Fifth in front of a jury." The attorney looked at her hand. He looked at the Capitol dome. He shook. The Civilian Oversight Board published its first report on a Thursday in March 2026. 2 years after Franklin had sat in the law library with his constitutional law textbook and his red recording light. He read it in his new office, Williams and Santos civil rights advocates, the sign still fresh on the door, and felt something he couldn't name. 0 instances of racial profiling in 47 stops. Body camera compliance at 100%. Minority student stops at 42%, matching the demographic reality of the student body. Complaints down 73%. The numbers were victory. The numbers were proof that systems could change when forced to account for themselves. But Franklin kept returning to the photograph accompanying the report. The law library's main reading room, the same oak table near the windows where he'd been arrested. A student sat there now, black headphones on, laptop open. No red recording light, no need for one. He closed the report and looked out his own window onto a street that wasn't Georgetown's manicured quad. Their firm had represented 12 clients in 6 months, 8 settlements, 4 pending. All campus police misconduct. All students who'd documented, who'd persisted, who'd found attorneys who wouldn't back down. The pattern Anderson had built was being dismantled one case at a time, but Franklin knew the truth. They were treating symptoms. The disease was older, deeper, the belief that certain spaces required certain faces, that tax dollars came with invisible conditions. That safety meant surveillance for some and protection for others. His phone buzzed. A text from Jasmine Carter, new client referral, public defender in Baltimore. "Kid arrested for studying in a library. Sound familiar?" Franklin typed back. "Send me the details." "And Jasmine, tell him to check if his laptop has a camera." He set down the phone and opened his own laptop. The OBS file was still there, 4 hours and 38 minutes, preserved on 3 cloud servers and a physical drive in his desk. He hadn't watched it in months. He didn't need to. The moment had become something else now, not trauma, but tool. Evidence of what happened when you stayed calm, stated it clearly, let them talk. When you had an uncle who knew. When you had a professor who'd been waiting. When you had 3 cameras and the patience to use them. But also, evidence of what shouldn't be required, the perfection of the victim. The documentation of the ordinary. The need to prove that studying while Black was still studying, still ordinary, still protected by the same constitution that protected everyone else. Franklin closed the laptop. Outside, evening was coming, the light shifting from gold to institutional gray, the same light that had filled the library 2 years ago. He thought of Sean Anderson, working in a warehouse now, his certification revoked, his name in a database of officers who could never testify, never wear a badge. Never again tell someone they didn't belong. He didn't feel satisfaction. He felt the weight of surveillance turned backward, of a career destroyed not by malice but by the refusal to admit malice existed. And he thought of the scholarship fund. The first recipient would start Georgetown Law in September, a student from Baltimore interested in civil rights. Franklin had reviewed the application personally. In the essay, the student had written, "I want to learn the law so I know when it's being broken, and I want to learn it in a library where I don't have to record myself to feel safe." Franklin stood and walked to the window. The city was lighting up, ordinary and complex, full of people studying, working, existing in spaces that had never questioned their right to be there. And full of others, like he'd been, who would learn to count silences, to state their lack of consent, to let the red light burn while they waited for the system to catch up to what they'd always known. He didn't record himself anymore. The accountability theater had served its purpose, taught him to see himself seeing, to witness his own attention and his own fear. Now he just worked. Just represented, just tried to build something that might outlast the need for perfect victims with perfect evidence. The phone buzzed again. "Alton, dinner Sunday. I'm making crab cakes." Franklin smiled, typed back, "I'll bring the constitutional law textbooks, for old time's sake." He turned off the office light and stepped into the evening, unrecorded, unremarkable, free. The red light was off. The law for now was on.